In this video, I'm going to talk about an opening sequence to a Bond film that had a huge impact on me. If there is a Bond opening that you love, let me know in the comments section. It would be fun to compare notes. For Your Eyes Only, directed by John Glenn for Eon Productions, came out in the summer of 1981. I would have been 12 when it made its way to the small theater in my hometown. Although a lot of James Bond films had come out before then, I'd never seen one in a theater. I'd probably never actually watched any Bond films in their entireties, to tell the truth. I'd seen beginnings, middles, or endings on TV, but never a whole film. Yet I knew of the character and could recognize him as Roger Moore. Yes, Roger Moore was James Bond, for me anyway. I never put it together that the snippets I'd seen of Sean Connery were him playing the same character, and George Lazenby and his outing as Bond was totally unknown to me. That last part is ironic, considering what my video includes. I saw every 007 film that came out after that, when they made it to the theater in my hometown. In the meantime, came my family's VCR, and soon after, video rentals. It took a while, but I was eventually able to get through all of the Bond films I had missed before For Your Eyes Only. I understood that the character had been recast twice prior to Roger Moore picking up the mantle, and the pre-credits sequence in For Your Eyes Only took on a deeper meaning for me as I understood what it referenced. Later on, I learned why the sequence had been written that way, and gained deeper insight into what it accomplished for the character, the film, and the audience's expectations. Let's take a look at the opening to For Your Eyes Only. The film opens in a cemetery. Bond walks up to a grave and lays roses upon it. The headstone reads, Teresa Bond, 1943 to 1969, beloved wife of James Bond. We have all the time in the world. What did 12-year-old me learn from this? Bond had been married before. His wife had died. She was only 26 years old at that time. Young. It happened 12 years prior to the events of this film. I had no idea that they had met, fallen in love, gotten married, and been separated by her death in an earlier film in the series. All this established for me is that Bond had a history, and a sad one at that. Things had happened in his past that I didn't know about. It helped flesh him out as a complete character. A priest approaches Bond and tells him that his office is sending a helicopter to pick him up. It is an emergency, to which Bond responds, "It usually is." The younger me understood that Bond was important. His job dealt with crises. He was always on the clock. As Bond takes off, he notices the priest watching somberly while crossing himself. It didn't occur to me at that time that the priest might have been in on what was about to happen. The camera cuts to a white cat being stroked by a mysterious hand. The mystery is partially solved when the scene cuts to a wider shot of a man with a bald head, wearing a suit, sitting in a wheelchair. His back is to the camera, so we can't see his face. Not having seen the Connery Bond films, I had no idea who Blofeld was. But I later learned that this was who the man represented. Ernst Stavro Blofeld, head of Spectre, Bond's nemesis. And while his hand didn't pull the trigger, also the man responsible for the murder of Bond's wife. I knew none of this at the time, but I would soon understand that this was someone with a grudge against Bond, someone from his past. Again, Bond had a history that I wasn't yet aware of, and that made him more intriguing to the younger me. In front of this bald man, attached to his high-tech wheelchair, sits a bulky control panel with buttons, switches, joysticks, and monitor screens. This unnamed man electrocutes the helicopter pilot, killing him, and then takes control of the helicopter. "Good afternoon, Mr. Bond," he laughs. "Don't concern yourself with the pilot. One of my less useful people. You are now flying remote control airways." Yes, they definitely know each other. As the bald man flies the helicopter dangerously around factories and chimneys, Bond desperately tries to gain entry to the pilot's area, which is partitioned off from the passenger area where Bond was sitting by a glass barrier. Bond is successful, taking over flying duties and guiding the helicopter towards his adversary. The cat knows what is coming next and wisely jumps down and runs away. The bald man tries in vain to roll away from harm, but Bond swoops down and catches the wheelchair on one of the helicopter landing struts. The bald man pleads with Bond, saying, "We can do a deal! I'll buy you a delicatessen in stainless steel!" As the bald man continues begging for mercy, Bond flies over a tall industrial chimney, angles the helicopter forward and down, causing the man and his wheelchair to slide off the strut and plummet down into the chimney, presumably to his death. My main takeaways as a 12-year-old moviegoer were that Bond had a past. He had a wife who died, so it was a sad past. He had clever and dangerous enemies, so it was a dangerous past. The enemy in this case, this bald man with the cat, was in a wheelchair, so I could assume that Bond had injured him gravely during some previous mission that I was not yet aware of. And, most of all, I knew that Bond was cool under pressure, and very resourceful, and could figure his way out of any predicament. In the following years, as I became familiar with all of the preceding 007 films, and with film production and film trivia in general, this opening sequence took on a much deeper meaning for me. Here is some development trivia. Director John Glenn felt that after 1979's Moonraker, Bond needed to get back to his roots. For Your Eyes Only was supposed to follow The Spy Who Loved Me, as seen in that film's end credits. But due to the success of Star Wars in 1977, lots of studios jumped on the outer space bandwagon. Hence the decision to launch Bond into orbit. For Your Eyes Only got pushed back. Moonraker was very successful, but very expensive, so coupled with a recession at the start of the 1980s, the next Bond film would have to have a lower budget. As a result, the studio needed a cheaper director than the ones who had helmed previous 007 outings. So John Glenn was promoted from his position as film editor and took over directorial duties for this film, and the next 4 as well. As I mentioned, the plan was for Bond to go back to his roots. This film was to be harder-edged, more of a thriller than a romp, as Glenn put it. Bond would be more realistic, less cartoony, less reliant on gadgets, and more dependent on his own wits and ingenuity. This is evidenced later on in the film, when Bond's tricked-out Q-branch car explodes before Bond even gets to use any of its fancy features. And again when Bond has to climb up the side of a mountain, using his shoelaces. On top of this were 2 other important elements. One was that when the film was being written, the producers didn't know if Moore would be back or not. Roger Moore had initially signed up for 3 pictures, a deal which covered Live and Let Die in 1973, The Man with the Golden Gun in 1974, and The Spy Who Loved Me in 1977. With Moonraker, Moore and his agent had negotiated his participation on a film-by-film basis, and producers were becoming concerned about the actor's age. Other actors were being considered to take over the role, So For Your Eyes Only might have to serve as a reintroduction of the character to audiences. Hence the decision to reference aspects of Bond's past that had been put aside so far in the Moore era. He had been married and lost his wife, referenced in a way in Diamonds Are Forever as Bond seeks revenge for Tracy's murder, but never again brought up in film after that until For Your Eyes Only. His arch-nemesis was Blofeld, head of Spectre, who came into conflict with Bond in numerous films prior to the Moore era. That organization never played a role during the Moore era. Inclusions of previous plot elements, such as this, would link a new actor to Bond's history and, in theory, put the minds of audience members at ease. On top of this were issues about certain rights to the Blofeld character. Kevin McClory, who had co-written Thunderball, claimed ownership of the concepts for the iconic look of the Blofeld character and the organization Spectre. McClory would go on to co-write and executive produce Never Say Never Again in 1983, an adaptation of the novel Thunderball, which had been based on the original story for the movie Thunderball, also co-written by McClory. In essence, it was a remake of that film. Due to the dispute over character rights, Eon Productions couldn't use the names of the character or organization. The decision was to have an unnamed villain who looked and sounded like Blofeld, but whose face was never shown and name never mentioned, injured in a wheelchair to reflect damage taken in Bond's previous and apparently failed attempt to get revenge in Diamonds Are Forever, trying to kill Bond and getting killed off himself once and for all. Eon Productions was saying that Blofeld and Spectre were things of the past, and that Bond didn't need such contrivances going forward. Now, knowing all of this background, and having seen all Bond films that came before For Your Eyes Only, what does the present me get out of this scene? Number 1, James Bond was a fully formed character with a tragic history full of danger. Number 2, he had been married and lost his wife. Number 3, his old enemies still held grudges and could reappear at any time. Number 4, Bond is clever and resourceful, able to get out of predicaments using his wits and the things around him. Number 5, this film was going to dispense with certain tropes established in previous Bond outings. Number 6, one such trope was Bond's reliance on gadgets. In fact, Blofeld's cumbersome, high-tech wheelchair, with its giant helicopter control panel, was ultimately useless in getting the job done. Such gadgetry was not an advantage here. 7. Additionally gone were overly complicated death traps for Bond, such as this remote control helicopter fiasco. Why not plant a bomb in the helicopter that would go off as soon as Bond got on board? If the priest was part of the conspiracy to kill Bond, as suggested when Bond sees the priest crossing himself, why not have the priest shoot Bond? Or just plant a bomb at the gravesite itself and blow Bond up when he visited? We saw that later in No Time to Die, Daniel Craig's final outing as the character. The opening scene is almost a parody of previous attempts to kill Bond, all of which failed because their complexity gave Bond time to figure a way out of what could have been certain death. Number 8. Loose ends regarding revenge for his wife were now tied up definitively. Number 9. The trope of a criminal organization bent on world domination, helmed by an evil mastermind, was tossed away like a joke and would not be used at all again in the Moore era. Number 10, and most importantly, even if the actors changed, there was still a continuity between this James Bond and previous iterations of the character. What had happened to Bond before had happened to this Bond as well. Things that Bond did would have consequences going forward, at least for the remainder of the Moore era. All of these films, from Connery through Lazenby and on to Moore, were all telling the uninterrupted story of one man. There you have it. The opening sequence of For Your Eyes Only is doing some heavy lifting, serving as a comforting reintroduction to James Bond, even though they didn't change actors in the end, showing newer viewers elements of Bond's backstory, which might pique their interest in learning more about this character by watching older films, giving the middle finger to Kevin McClory and the rights dispute, dispensing with gadgetry and science fiction, mocking overly convoluted death traps, and so on. I think the 12-year-old me had the right of it. The curiosity raised about Bond and his history made watching the earlier Bond films more interesting and enjoyable, and connecting the dots between things in this opening sequence made it almost seem like For Your Eyes Only should be the place to start when exploring the Connery-Lazenby-Moore era. Begin with this older Bond, with his scars, damaged but never defeated, and then go back and see how he came to be. For Your Eyes Only is a great jumping-on point for viewers who boarded the train with the Daniel Craig reboot films and are not familiar with the original timeline of Bond. Anyway, if you made it this far, thank you for watching. Remember, if you have a favorite Bond opening sequence, let everyone know in the comments section. It is always fun to compare Bond preferences. There are so many films to look at, and no one is wrong, just different. Thanks for watching. See you next time.